The woke right is they're going to appeal to your love of order and want to make you into an activist that brings forward an oppressive king.
Dan, welcome. Welcome on to Doctrine and Governance. You were one of the first people that I wanted to have on when I did this, so appreciate you taking me up on the offer.
Yes, I when I heard you were going to start this channel, I was very, very excited. I think this channel is going to be a voice of reason that is very needed right now.
Yeah, we in the past couple of years have gotten really good at kind of the apologetics, more gospel type of stuff online, but I think there's a niche in more of the political doctrine, cultural type of space that someone like Greg Mattson, for example, does fill, but I thought it wouldn't hurt to have another voice in there, and hopefully I have a couple things to say, and if not, you have a couple things to say, so that's
I
why you're
do.
on. So today we're going to be talking about the woke left, but maybe even more especially the woke right, which seems to be an unfortunate development over the past, I don't know, year or two.
Yep.
So yeah, just take us through what your thoughts are on this.
Okay, so I put together a presentation on woke left and right, and it's understanding the horseshoe theory. Now, so I'm going to go ahead and move through this. At and I'll start by saying the horseshoe theory is the idea that politics is kind of shaped like a horseshoe, where at the extremes are very, very close to each other, like the ends of a horseshoe, right? So, in fact, they mirror each other, they look like each other, they sound like each other. And so I'm going to go ahead and talk through that. And let's begin by asking this question on this next slide. What is woke? Okay. And that's a question that a number of people have asked over the past few years. And there are some simple ways of defining it. And one of those is that woke is a political term that means an awakening to critical consciousness. It's like you've awakened to a realization of how bad things are, and how much things are in need of criticism and reform and change and so forth. Now, wokeness is the Marxist worldview applied to current situations. We're going to need to talk about what that means, and so I'm going to move and talk about this image of a light switch. Okay, and I'm going to use this as a metaphor to introduce the Marxist worldview. Now, Luke, I'm going to ask you a question. And this is, if you're looking to be entertained, then you might want to fast forward through this part because we have to talk about some heavy kind of stuff when we talk about Marxism. You just can't avoid it, right? So, but I want to ask a question, and I'm going to ask it to Luke, but also anybody who watches this presentation. Um, let's say you are out in your yard, you're doing some yard work, and you're digging, and you pull up, there's a buried switch, okay? And this switch, you dust it off, and it turns out this is the switch that can be flipped that will shift us into the millennium. Okay. Now in the scriptures, we read of the millennium that all war is going to cease. Weapons will be made into plowshares. The lion will lie down with the lamb. It will be all peace and harmony in the millennium. It will be perfect. Okay. There will not be the kinds of conflicts and suffering and unfairness and tragedy that we currently experience in our fallen world. But so you see this switch and you're amazed. You found the millennium switch right there in your backyard, right? But you also know that it is not your switch to flip. It's God's switch to flip. Somehow it ended up in your yard, but it's not your switch to flip. Okay. Luke, where did you serve your mission?
I was in West Africa, Ghana for
Okay.
a year, Sierra Leone for a year.
Okay. Let me ask you a question, and I'm asking this to your viewers as well. Have you ever seen something on your mission or in any other place that was so upsetting to you, so disturbing, so unsettling that in that moment, if you had that switch available to you, you probably would have flipped it.
Oh,
Even knowing that it's God's switch to flip, you
you
probably
know
would have flipped
what?
it anyway.
I thought you were going to ask me if I would flip the switch, and I was going to say no. But now you've asked this question,
Yeah.
and I would say there probably have been moments that I might go ahead
Yeah.
and do it.
Yeah. So I years ago from 2005 to 2006, I worked in Baghdad, and that was during the war. And it was during an awful time of the war. And so I was working on a defense project, and I had a couple of different email addresses from government agencies, and um, one of the agencies used to send out briefings that were like trying to promote morale, like for everybody who's all the Americans who were living and working in Baghdad, all the military personnel and so forth. There was another agency of people who did not like what we were doing, and they would send out different briefings on, and I got these on my other email address, and they were designed to um, show people how awful things were, right, in Iraq. And sometimes it was pretty awful there. And there was one day they sent out some a briefing, PowerPoint slides, and I didn't always read their briefings, but that day I decided to. And I'm flipping through, and I came across a picture of the aftermath of a car bombing in Baghdad. And the picture was taken by a professional photographer, and he or she zeroed in on a child, okay, right after a car bombing. And I'm not going to get any more specific than that. Um, but it was an image that shook me so deeply that I'm telling you, if I had that switch right in front of me at my desk, I probably would have flipped it right then and there. There are some things that you can see or experience that are just, they will rattle you to your core like that. Um, and there are probably, honestly, a lot of people, a lot of your viewers have probably had a moment like that where they have seen or experienced something where they would have flipped the switch. Okay. Now, why do I talk about this switch in the context of Marxism? Well, the Marxist worldview is essentially the idea that that switch is available to each of us. We can usher in the perfect world. We can do it. We don't have to wait for God. All these promises in the Bible of this perfect future. Well, you know what, God, we're waiting and it hasn't happened yet. So let's go ahead and do it ourselves. That is the Marxist worldview. Okay. And when we talk about Marx, and now I'm going to transition to a discussion of kind of the model of the Marxist worldview with the superstructure and the base, okay, where you can kind of map different kinds of oppression, right? Now, and what Marx did, and there are a lot of people, exactly what Marxism is a fight that has been going on since the time of Marx. And that's why I talk about his worldview, because I don't want to get into, the particulars of his economic
Hmm.
mathematical theory and stuff like that. And But he had a worldview, and his worldview has shaped the modern world tremendously. So he taught in the Communist Manifesto the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. And so he said there's society has a superstructure, and that's just kind of a, these things that we experience, our culture, politics, religion, art, and family and entertainment. And he said that those things reinforce an ideology. And the ideology that he focused on was capitalism, right? Now, capitalism was something that it's kind of a concept that he invented to explain just, free markets, the rule of law, um, liberal societies, societies that are all about freedom, right? Um, Now, our that superstructure, those ways that we live, those create and reinforce a base. And this is our day-to-day experience of life, how we produce goods and earn a living and buy things and create things, the means of production, the relationships of production, how we live and work. Now, he said that these are characterized by systems of oppression and by alienation. We're not doing exactly what we want to do every single day, right? We are forced to work jobs that we don't necessarily that aren't our personal dream all the time, right? So we feel alienated from what we would our kind of our true desires, right? So this is the Marxist worldview. It's kind of a formula for mapping how society is oppressive. And beyond capitalism, though, the Marxist worldview has actually expanded to where Marxist thinkers they focus on these other things like white supremacy or heteronormativity or Western cultural supremacy. So I bring up that one because there's a lot of discussion of that kind of thing in relation to Israel these days. Israel is a country in the Middle East that has very Western systems, right? And so a lot of people find that very oppressive, for them to operate that way in that region. Now, moving on, let's talk about Marxism in terms of kind of a tree, okay? And at the roots of the tree, you have Marx's theories and his worldview. And then after the time of Marx, Marxism branched into things that we call like cultural Marxism, where it's like, okay, let's look at this worldview and let's apply it to culture. And Marxist thinkers did that because they said, Marx's actual historical predictions and theories didn't pan out the way that he and others thought they would. And so there must be cultural problems preventing Marx's vision from coming to fruition, right? And so you had this group called the Frankfurt School, and that was a group of academics and researchers who developed this thing called critical theory, where they said, okay, normal academic theory tries to explain the way the world is, but that's not what theory should do. Let's apply theory to criticize the status quo and promote change in the world and liberation. Okay, liberation from oppression. And then you also had branches of political movements like, Leninism in Russia and Maoism and, some other places. So modern fruits of the Marxist worldview are things like queer theory, liberation theology, Marxist feminism, critical race theory, and then decolonizing or dependency theory. When I say Marxism, I mean all of the parts of this tree, right? So that is how I use the term, and that's how a lot of people use the term nowadays. So moving on.
It seems to me like, I've explained it like this before, kind of the woke worldview is just a worldview that says there's an oppressor an oppressed class. And
Yeah.
all of history is the story of these oppressors and oppressed classes, whatever you want to do it. If it's going to be gay and straight, or if it's going to be male and female, black and white, rich and poor, whatever it is, you put it into that model, and the story of history is the story of those two classes. And the way to remedy that is for the lower class to fight and kind of overthrow and change up the system that perpetuates that ongoing struggle. Would you say
That
that's
yes, that is the starting point of the woke worldview. The Marxist worldview is you look at every single problem in the world and you say, who are the oppressors and who are the oppressed? And in the Marxist worldview, you say, okay, uh, I'm going to define the oppressors as the people who have more stuff than the other people, right? If they're more wealthy or privileged or their lifestyle and their choices are considered normal, then they are the oppressors, and the other people are the marginalized, the excluded, the oppressed. So absolutely right. Oppressor versus oppressed, that whole dichotomy is the starting point of this worldview. Okay, so
but
moving on.
then people
Yeah,
come at this narrative from kind of a left hand and a right hand
yes.
political
And
perspective.
yes, and
It's
we
not
will
exclusive to one.
right.
Back in 2020, it kind of seemed to be more exclusive to the left,
Yeah.
but things have changed a bit, I think.
Yeah, they have. And we'll talk through some actual specifics of that on the right as we proceed. Because it's kind of fascinating to see that we are seeing that as a recent phenomenon, but it actually goes back to like the mid 1900s.
Mhm.
That around the time of World War One, World War Two, that the woke right, what we're talking about, was already showing up back then, in various forms. So now moving on, I want to read some quotes, and these are from a very famous philosopher. And as I read these quotes, and they're called The Left Hand Path, they're from an essay that he wrote. And as I read these quotes, you might get like you might feel sick as I read these because we're reading something that is pretty disturbing, right? But you have to understand this in order to understand what we're talking about. This philosopher said, quote, mankind has always had two types of spirituality, two paths, the right-hand path and the left-hand path. The first is characterized by a positive attitude towards the surrounding world, in which harmony, balance, bliss, and peace are seen. All evil is but a particular instance, a local deviation from the norm, something insignificant, transient, having no deep transcendental causes. The right hand path is also called the Milky Way. It does not subject man to any particular suffering. It protects him from radical experiences, leads him away from immersion in suffering, and away from the nightmare of being. This is a false path. It leads to slumber. It leads to nowhere. Now, so this philosopher, he's talking about a way of being in the world where you think, people are good. And that's kind of your starting assumption is people are good. And when we see evil come up, that's out of the ordinary. It's not it's something has gone wrong when we see evil come up, right? And because people are generally good, so somebody lost their way somewhere, somebody experienced something that has led them to evil. um Now, and that is what he is calling the right hand path. It's just this positive view of humanity and of the world around us. Now he says this is a false path. It leads to slumber, it leads to nowhere. Now, when he says it leads to slumber, think of what Karl Marx said: religion is the opiate of the masses. He was saying religion is it's like a drug. You know, it it keeps people numb so they can't get agitated and feel their oppression and want revolution and those kinds of things. That's what he was talking about. So this philosopher is saying the same kind of thing as the right hand path leads to slumber. Okay.
And this kind
Now,
of seems like the all is well in Zion kind of path.
yeah, yeah. Uh, it is, and it's also just kind of like just having a positive worldview, though.
Hmm.
Like believing that people are good, that the world is actually good, right, in general. Um, and take into it, an unhealthy extreme, you do have the all is well in Zion mode of being where you just cannot acknowledge any problems, right?
Hmm.
Um, so let's talk a little bit more about the left-hand path. He said the second path, the left-hand path, sees everything in the reverse. There is no milky bliss but black suffering, no silent calm but the festering fiery drama of split being. This is the path of wine. It is destructive, terrifying. Wrath and rage reign on it. In this path, all reality is perceived as hell, as ontological exile, as torture, as submersion into the heart of some kind of unthinkable catastrophe originating from the very heights of the cosmos. If on the first path everything appears to be good, then on the second path everything appears evil. This path is monstrously difficult, but it is the only true one. On this path, it is easy to stumble and even easier to disappear. It guarantees nothing, it entices no one. But only this path is correct. He who takes this path will gain fame and immortality. He who survives it will prevail and receive an award that is higher than being. He says, he who goes down the left hand path knows that it will end. The dungeon of matter will collapse and be transformed into a heavenly city. So there's that biblical language, right?
Hmm.
Of like an ideal future. A chain of initiates passionately prepares the desired moment, the moment of the end, the triumph of total liberation. So liberation is, one of the most common terms in Marxism,
Hmm.
right? So, um, this is two ways of being in the world. And this philosopher is a man who has dabbled in the occult. And further along in this essay, he says that uh, you have manifestations of the left hand path, which is where you just see the world as unbelievably awful, and it all needs to be destroyed and whatever, right? You burn it all down is kind of the way of being in the left hand path. And he says there are manifestations of it among people like Karl Marx, right? Um, Lenin, Stalin, and these other kinds of people. And he says there are manifestations of it on the right, with the Nazis and some of these other Mussolini and some of these other figures. He's saying what he says is these people are doing the same thing. Okay, they've all jumped onto this thing that is called the left-hand path. Now, who is this philosopher? Well, moving forward, we see here's an image. Tucker Carlson interviews Putin's brain, Aleksandr Dugin. That is the philosopher that I've just
Okay.
quoted.
Okay.
Yeah,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Alexander Dugin wrote that.
And so
And
also contemporary,
yeah, yeah,
still alive. Yeah.
yeah. So he is one of the strongest voices promoting Russia's attacks on Ukraine. He has the things that he says about Russia and war, like you honestly can't believe that somebody would say these things. Like he just has no problem with entire countries being wiped out in the service
Mhm.
of Russia's ambitions.
Well, yeah, it's like the birth of a Russian utopia,
Yeah,
a new. uh, If I'm remembering correctly, it's he's like getting rid of the East and the West, and just kind of everything's this new Russian
yeah,
culture, Russian golden age.
yeah.
Yeah.
Russia would basically conquer all of Europe. That is his vision, is that Russia just takes over, more than half of the world, basically. He believes that Russia has kind of this spiritual destiny, right? Now, how they get there is you have to destroy a lot of things and do a lot of horror. That's
Hmm.
the best word for it, right? So here are a couple of his social media posts, and I've underlined this phrase, compatible with right woke.
Hmm.
And he says, now it is time for American right woke to make regime change in Europe, right? So we say woke right. He says right woke. Um, Same thing, right? What he is seeing is there's left woke and there's right woke. They are the same thing. One of them just is the correct woke. Okay.
Hmm.
That's right woke. That is what he is promoting. It is the Marxist worldview, but it's applied in service of things that Marxists don't usually apply it to. So moving forward, here is a picture of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, right? And here's where we see the horseshoe in a single quote. He said, I recognize that between us, the fascists, right, and the communists, there are no political affinities, but there are intellectual affinities. We, like you, believe that a centralizing and unitary state is necessary that imposes an iron discipline on all individuals, with this difference that you reach this conclusion through the concept of class, and we reach it through the concept of nation. Okay. Saying we're doing the same thing, we're just arriving at it through different ideas. Okay.
Hmm.
That is a remarkable quote.
Yeah.
You see woke left and woke right in a single quote from this fascist dictator.
And I'm assuming that's from like the 1930s,
Yeah.
like almost
Yeah.
100 years ago.
Yeah. Woke right goes way back, everybody. It goes way
Hmm.
back. So here is another really great quote. And moving forward, there's a book called The Faces of Janus by James Greger. He's a historian, Marxism and Fascism in the 20th Century. Now, he says The Faces of Janus. Well, Janus was a Roman god that had two faces. And so he's basically, this book, he's arguing that Marxism and fascism are the same thing. They're two faces of the same creature, right? And I'm not going to read all of this quote, but he says, I'll read the second part. He says, more significant for the present discussion, by the turn of the decade, that's the 1960s, the radicals of the great proletarian cultural revolution in China were identifying the Soviet Union itself as a fascist dictatorship. By the late 1960s and the early 1970s, Marxist theoreticians in both the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China began to employ the concept of fascism in their criticisms of each other's system. So you have Marxists in Russia and China calling each other's countries fascist. Are they right? Who's right? Luke?
Both.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. What is fascism? This strong nationalistic state led by an iron fisted dictator? That's what you
Yeah.
had in China. That's what you had in Russia.
Hmm.
How in the world did these Marxist states become fascist? Right? What happened? Do you have any ideas about that, Luke?
Well, I would say that they have the same narrative as any other fascist state. They just put different actors in the roles of the antagonist and the antagonized.
Right, right. So I wrote a book on Marxism, and the metaphor that I used in the book was of a factory. I said, imagine a factory is going to be set up in your town, and they say, "Hey, we're gonna produce cars. This factory is going to produce cars." And there's a lot of people in town who are like, wow, that would be so cool to work on building cars and assembling cars. So I'm going to go to work for this factory. But when they go and they actually start working for the factory, they realize they're producing toaster ovens, not cars, right? Well, what happened? Despite what the factory advertised, it is designed to produce something different than what it advertises, right?
Hmm.
There's something in the design of the factory that is leading it to produce toaster ovens and not cars, right? Marxism claims to produce a classless utopia of cooperative, harmonious, classless society, right? Um, but the factory actually produces authoritarianism. That's what it produces. It advertises one thing, but it is designed to produce an iron fisted dictator who oppresses people on a scale that is unimaginable. I mean, think of Maoist China, Stalinist Russia.
Hmm.
Think of the amount of lives lost, the amount of suffering that those two societies produced. That is the Marxist factory. It claims to produce one thing, but its design actually leads it to produce something completely different. So, your answer was correct, Luke. The Chinese were right about Russia being fascist, and the Russian Marxists were right about China being fascist. So, now let's talk about the components of woke, and here's where we get specific. And the first is there's that division of the world into oppressors and oppressed that you mentioned, Luke. And then the acquisition of power is more important than truth. And that's just a basic assumption of critical theory. We have historical revisionism, and then a notion of a pure people. That is something that comes up in both. And then also a utopian vision. Okay. And finally, projection. So let's talk through each of these, and I'll try to move through them fairly quickly. And the first one is the division of the world into oppressors and oppressed. So you can see woke left, you have this image of a protester, a pro-Palestine protester at Columbia University. And the headline is Columbia student gets grilled by reporter after the student demands that the university send food and water to student protesters occupying Hamilton Hall. So when you have this narrative that everybody is in one camp or the other, oppressors or oppressed, what it does is it creates incentives. If you are a leftist, you now see that you don't even have value if you're not in the camp of the oppressed. So you're going to crave that experience of oppression, even if you have to create it on your own, like
Hmm.
manufacture an artificial experience of oppression. Like, you guys are not letting food and water into this building that we have occupied, which we shouldn't have, but we're
Yeah.
doing so it totally manufactured, you know, dramatic experience of oppression so that they can feel like they have a sense of personal value. Because the narrative is you do not want to be on the side of the oppressors. You want to be one of the oppressed. Now, these are spoiled rich kids at Columbia, let's be honest. Um, and so,
Yeah.
so, so they have to appropriate oppression, right? They have to
Hmm.
find a way to become part of this oppressed class, right? Now, on the woke right, here's a great social media post. Dying for Israel really is the handmaid's tale fantasy of the right wing. And that was something that a lot of people started saying when President Trump was talking about, you know, going after Iran's nuclear program, possibly
Hmm.
getting involved militarily. You had people on the right saying, I'm not going to die for Israel. Well, no, you're not.
No.
There'll probably be some
Yeah.
bombs dropped.
And there
But
were,
yeah, there
and
were.
it's over.
Right.
Yeah.
But there was this desire to, oh, I need to frame things in terms of oppressor and oppressed. And I'm oppressed by Israel.
Yeah.
Because
And unfortunately, well, you'd have Tucker Carlson like, guys, if a single bomb drops in Iran, World War III has
yep,
started. The apocalypse is here. This is
yeah,
terrible. Oh, and the hand wringing and the pearl clutching. And then
yeah,
he dropped the bomb. and Iran shot a few pre-planned missiles that were designed not to hurt any US military bases. The ceasefire was called, and it's like out of the news cycle now,
Right.
basically, a week
Right.
later. I'm guessing that most of these people haven't stopped to think. Wait a second. Was the narrative that I was participating in, was the narrative structure that I was slotting these events into a valid structure or not?
Right.
Because clearly it didn't go where I thought it was going to go.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that introspection really happened at all. We're just kind of moving on to the next news story.
Yeah. But it was an interesting case study of how people on the right can manufacture a narrative of
Hmm.
oppression, right? Okay, so now here's a meme that I created, and woke left and woke right are united in hatred of Jews. You see a lot of anti-Semitism
Yep.
in both camps. Now, why is that? Why is there so much anti? I've always known that there was tons of anti-Semitism on the left. People on the left were in denial of it for a long time, but they're not in denial of it now. Like now it's everybody knows. But if you think about, the again, if you're putting everybody into these categories of oppressor and oppressed, Jews historically have been very successful beyond what they should be expected to be, right?
Yep.
um, because they actually have been an oppressed group of people throughout
Hmm.
history, and yet they're very influential throughout the world in so many societies. Now, if you're not a Marxist, you can look at that and say, wow, that is so cool. Like, how do you do that? If you're a group of people, what do they do that leads them to have so much influence in the world? And how can I cultivate that among my people, right?
Hmm.
And then you get into some really productive conversations around social capital and networking and family ties and heritage and how all of these things are just amazing, right? And as Latter-day Saints, we know that. It's why we are kind of in the same boat where we punch above our weight, right?
Hmm.
So, but if your worldview is one of envy and bitterness and resentment and those kinds of things, then the Jews are a very easy target for it. Now, on the woke right, you have a lot of people who recognize. So, enemies of the woke right are typically Marxism and the entertainment industry, and those kinds of groups where Jews are definitely very heavily represented. Marxism attracts a lot of very high IQ individuals. High IQ doesn't mean they have wisdom, obviously. It just means they have intellectual candle power. They
Yep.
they often don't use it in good ways, right? And that's the truth with Marxism. A lot of the most influential figures in Marxism have been Jewish or had a Jewish heritage. Now, that is why, as we talk through Marxism, a lot of you will probably be saying, wait a minute, ha- this sounds like the Bible, right? This utopian society and language around transformation and liberation and all it, like these things, there are biblical versions of these concepts. Well, if you have intellectuals who grew up hearing biblical concepts and then they lose their belief in God, they don't ditch those biblical concepts. They just transfer them to their new ideology. And so that's
Hmm.
why Marxism is very, very much just kind of an imitation of biblical concepts.
Well,
Of
and in the gospel in the Bible, Jesus is the one that's ushering in the utopia. But then when you become atheist agnostic, you get rid
yeah,
of the beliefs associated with the Bible. All you have are the values, but now there's no Jesus to do it. And
right.
so you're the one that needs to do it.
We have to do it.
Yeah.
So critical theory, that's how
Hmm.
we're going to do it. Critical theory and activism, and revolution, all of these things. So I hope this is helpful for understanding why there's so much anti-Semitism on both the left and the right. There's just kind of this, both of them have deep resentments toward Jews. We don't need to have that, right? As Latter-day Saints, not our circus, right?
No.
We do not have to traffic in anti-Semitism. We should avoid it, you know, all the time. Okay, so let's move on to number two. The acquisition of power is more important than truth. And this is kind of the foundation of critical theory. So here you have the CEO of NPR, a very left leaning organization, saying, in fact, our reverence for the truth might be a distraction that's getting in the way of finding common ground and getting things done, right? If you're giving news to people and commentary to people, and you don't care about the truth as much as you care about quote unquote getting things done, I mean, that's a red flag, obviously, because
Mhm.
what are these things you want to get done
Yeah.
where truth is
That
not
the truth
important?
needs to be subservient to it. Yeah.
Right,
It's a little
right.
concerning.
Yeah. Now, on the woke right, you have Chris Rufo, a guy who has done a lot of things that I really agree with, in
Hmm.
terms of challenging the excesses of academia, for example. But he has kind of fallen in love with this influential Marxist thinker named Antonio Gramsci, who he developed this concept of cultural Marxism.
Hmm.
And where, and in this social media post, Chris Rufo said the right is learning new political tactics. We are not going to indulge the fantasies of the classical liberals who forfeited all of the institutions. So classical liberals, all that means is, people who believe in freedom, free markets, just attention to objective truth to the greatest degree possible, rigorous scientific investigation of issues, and so classical liberalism, one of its core values is you have to really seek the truth, right? But what if that value involves you losing some of your institutions because those become infested, I'll say, with people who don't care about the truth? You lose some of your universities and other institutions. That's an awful thing to experience in a society, but it's the price of freedom, right? It really, that's the sad reality is in a free society, some institutions are going to tank. They're going to collapse because they don't care about the truth. So let's move on to the next one. Number three, historical revisionism. On the woke left, you have the 1619 Project. Reframes American history in terms of oppression and and it turned out to be just an awful project that historians they they picked apart and they criticized it and they said this is just terrible because truth was not the core value of the 1619 Project, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Now on
It
the
was
woke
to recast 1619 as the year of the American founding.
yeah,
And so then
yeah,
all the history had to be done in service of that narrative. I mean, it's right on the title of the
yeah,
work.
right. And it was promoting a narrative that slavery was the founding of the
Yeah.
country, right?
1619 meaning the year that slaves came to the US.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that's historical revisionism. Now, that was a huge deal under Joseph Stalin in Russia. Under Mao, it was like get rid of all of the old narratives, right? That was what they did in the Cultural Revolution. Truth doesn't matter. You have to rewrite history in a way that's favorable to the revolution, to the objectives that we're seeking. So on the woke right, here you have this social media account, Martyr Made, and this is Daryl Cooper. He is he has a podcast where he talks about history, and man, um, I'm going to read this. Hitler tried again, going on the radio to broadcast a call for peace directly to the British people. Here you have somebody engaging in this narrative that Hitler was seeking peace, right? So part of the controversy around Daryl Cooper is he's been saying that Winston Churchill was not the hero of World War II, actually. He's probably the villain because here you had opportunities for peace from people like Hitler. Um, and then he
Not
says,
to mention in the Book of Mormon, gosh, what's the name? The Gadianton robbers, like, hey, we're gonna have peace, man. Like, all you need to
yeah,
do is do these one, two, three things, and then we can have peace, and let's
we
not
want
worry. And like
peace.
every even extremely antagonistic dictators, warmongers,
Yeah.
conquerors make some sort of preludes at
Yeah.
peace. And so just to
Yeah.
take them at face value like that is just
The worst,
historical
most
ignorance of
yeah,
the greatest degree.
absolutely. So you're exactly right. Some of the worst people in the history of the world have presented themselves as peacemakers.
Yeah.
Just just lay down and let us overrun your country and kill you all, and there won't be any war, right?
Yeah.
See?
Like as long as they've had an intern who took PR 101, they're going to do that. That doesn't mean they actually mean it.
Right, right. So he says Hitler would give back the parts of Poland that were not majority German and would work with the other powers to reach an acceptable solution to the Jewish problem. Oh my gosh, stop right there.
In
What
other
is the
words,
Jewish problem?
well, I think the community note here is pretty good. It says the Jewish
Yeah,
problem is a euphemism for the racist genocidal Nazi theory that Jews are corrupt and inferior race that is to blame with Germany for Germany's problems.
yeah. So
So
this is incredible. You have, here
So
he's
the kind, generous Hitler was like, "Hey, I'll give you back part of the territory that I conquered
yeah,
just a couple months ago, and then we'll kind of work together with the international community to get all these Jews out of here one way or
yeah.
the other, and then we'll be
On
good, man."
this Jewish problem, we'll figure it out
Yeah,
together. Like,
what a
oh
nice
my
guy.
gosh, unbelievable. But
But
this is
it's
his,
going around, it's making the rounds
yes, this is
on social media,
historical.
especially.
Absolutely. It's historical revisionism. So let's move on to number four, a notion of a pure people. And here I have an image of a struggle session in China under Mao, where they tried to purify society of any remnants of the past that were capitalistic or imperialistic. And so they would harass and just it was incredible how awful they were to average Chinese people, right? Now on the woke right, here is a social media post from June 28th, which is like 2 days ago, I guess.
Hmm.
And this is Nick Freitas. He's a representative in the in here in Virginia. And he says, "What the heck is going on?" I've censored that for you with sensitive ears. I am witnessing something on the right which I am used to seeing on the left, namely the speed with which people are getting canceled or excommunicated over disagreements that should not rise to the level of the hostility displayed. Now, this is the context of this is we're currently in the middle of debates over this, what they're calling the one big beautiful bill in
Hmm.
Congress that Congress is trying to send over to President Trump. And so the debates have been pretty vicious among people on the right. And he's saying, whoa, I'm like, can we have honest disagreement without this cancel culture and these witch hunts and these things that are common to the left? Well, if you are woke right, then the answer is no. You have struggle sessions. You are Maoist in your tactics if you are woke right. Okay. All right. Now, I've added another note here. The purity obsession is related to another thing that the woke left and right have in common, a sense of personal and national self-loathing. Okay. So, woke left, people on the woke left have a national self-loathing because they think the nation is irredeemably um, impure.
Hmm.
It's so compromised by our national sins of slavery, oppression, whatever, name the problem, that it all needs to be burned down and start over. Okay. Um, and there's also personal self-loathing. You have people on the woke left, they engage in these rituals of like confessing their privilege and those kinds of things because they've come to hate themselves because they've been given a narrative that they are oppressors, right? Now, on the right, national self-loathing comes from different things. It comes from different kinds of impurity. Traditionally, like fascism, for example, has said we need to be, it's blood and soil. If you're not of this kind of blood and racial makeup,
Hmm.
then you're impure and you're contaminating the nation. Now, sometimes these things all blend together, like they did in Cambodia in the under the Khmer Rouge, which was a Marxist fascist movement that wiped out a quarter of Cambodia's population. So, really interesting. I mean, you have to look into the psychology of these things. Now, number five, we're almost. I know this has been a workout. We're almost done here. Number five, a utopian vision. And I just mentioned the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. They had this idea called year zero. And year zero is when the switch gets flipped. Remember that switch we talked about at the beginning of this, where the world becomes totally different in an instant. Okay. So, Cambodia, when Cambodia was taken over by these Marxists, they flipped that switch and they declared year zero. They're going to wipe out all culture and traditions, our economy, everything. It's all done and we're starting over. And again, a quarter of the population were massacred during that process. Okay, woke right. And this is a group of Christian nationalist pastors on Right Response Ministries. So in the center is Joel Webbon. He's kind of a famous figure. And he says, and in this conversation, one of them says, hear me out, the president, the sovereign, the magistrate, Baron Trump. Okay, thinking that Donald Trump's son needs to become the king of a Christian nationalist state comes out and says, I've taken a task force. We've gone through every website. We've driven by every building, and we have logged thousands of churches with pride flags out front, women on the clergy, and there are soldiers on the street now. We are taking their property and we are giving it to the faithful churches in town. Somebody says, Amen, love it. And he says that is completely historically within the realm of the magistrate. He can do that. You are an apostate, wicked church, and your building, your land, your heritage is taken from you, and it is given to those that will bear the fruits of it. That's Christian nationalism.
Do you know
And
the denomination of these people?
I think it's like extreme Baptist.
Okay. I know the Catholics kind of have more of this
Yes, they
tendency,
do.
but I
Yeah.
didn't think these guys were Catholic, so I was
Ca-
curious.
no, no, this is Protestant. So Catholics have
Hmm.
integralism, which is their flavor of Christian nationalism. So who now if you are looking if you look at the idea of oh man it'd be so great if we were like an overtly Christian country, our government is Christian and it imposes Christianity on the country.
Yeah.
Okay,
I,
so
I
I'm
I go up, I follow, I track with that all the way until it's imposing Christianity.
right.
Like, yeah, it would be great if like Russell
Oh
Nelson was just as powerful as Donald Trump by
yeah,
choice.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to have more Christian members of Congress and in the judiciary, people who actually can bring the Christian worldview into their work. Now, but these people want it imposed by a single figure from the top, a
Hmm.
king, right,
Hmm.
who dictates everything. Now, let's say these guys got what they wanted, and let's say Baron Trump became king and did everything that these guys wanted. How do you think we would fare? as the Church of Jesus
As
Christ of Latter-day Saints.
you know, Cardin, I disagree with him on a number of political things, but he has somewhat of a point where he says the more Protestant the country or the politics of the country become, the more anti-Mormon they
Yes,
become.
yes,
We
absolutely
are,
correct.
yeah, we are definitely on the chopping block
Yep,
for these
n-
guys.
no question about it. Now, speaking of King Baron Trump, here's an image. Again, this is Aleksandr Dugin, the Russian
Hey,
philosopher we mentioned earlier. Right after Trump was reelected, Dugin posted this AI generated picture. I admire Baron Trump, future king of US and Canada Kingdom. Oh man. You can see what these people are doing. They're flattered, they crave power so much. Now, going back to the Book of Mormon, the Gadianton robbers. So if you want to map the woke left and woke right in the Book of Mormon, Gadianton robbers are the woke left, redistributionists,
mm-hmm,
egalitarian society. They and Maoist tactics, right? The Kingmen are the woke right,
uh-huh,
in my mind at
uh-huh,
least. In my
yeah,
mind at least, they feel entitled to power. They don't want the chaos of society. They want all of society's problems to be resolved by this exclusive person or group of people who take over kind of kingship and impose order. And if they can't get what they want, then let the whole place burn down. Let the Lamanites come through and raise it all to the ground. That's the worldview of the woke right. Is if we can't get what we want, then who cares? The country needs to just be destroyed, right? So anyway, that's my point of view about mapping these Book of Mormon movements. You might disagree, and if you do disagree, put that in the comments. I want to hear what you
yeah.
think.
I
Okay.
I have a slight like with the Chris Rufo one back on the number two.
Yeah.
I'm I'm kind of on the fence about that one a little bit because I
So
don't know
you
if he's so much I don't know if he's so much dismissing truth, but more so saying given that X is true, this
yeah.
is what needs to happen, but I'm not like a Chris Rufo expert. I haven't read every single tweet
Yeah.
he's put out over the
Yeah.
past couple months, so I don't know the full
So
background of this.
and I mainly put that up to show that he's jumping into Marxist thought. He's jumping into, Antonio Gramsci and some of these other
Hmm.
figures. They did not care about the truth. They kind of said they did here and there a few times, but it was all about the revolution. Now, by the time the Frankfurt School fully emerges, though, they really don't care about the truth. They do not. And so, but they, if you read some of these people, and some of you might be shocked to hear me say this. If when I read Antonio Gramsci and some of these other figures of cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School and stuff, I agree with a lot of things that they say. I if you read them, you will say, "Wow, you know, this idea that there are problems in culture that cause oppression for society." Yeah, that's absolutely right. When we complain about Disney going woke, for example, and universities being overtaken and imposing an oppressive ideology on the rest of us, we're almost doing the formula, right? Of that superstructure and the base. And we need to be careful that we don't go woke.
Hmm.
Um, I do think it is important to see why these things have appeal. What is the truth that people are trying to get at and failing? Because if we can speak to the truth honestly, then we can pull people back from the ledge of, before they jump over and they're calling for a king, right? A
Hmm.
Baron Trump king.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems as I've looked at this kind of stuff and other phenomena that has happened in the culture, it seems like when you go wrong when you're reacting to things.
Yeah.
So you have something like feminism, and that was reacting to the gender roles at the time, and then all these bad things happen because of feminism. But then someone like Andrew Tate comes along, and he's pushing back on it, but not with the foundation of I have this philosophy that I've worked out and feminism opposes that, but
Yeah.
more so like I see these bad things and so I'm just going to react to them.
Yeah.
I'm just going to oppose them without any foundation underneath, and then it just turns into its whole awful, bad, terrible thing just on the other direction.
Yeah.
And so I think the Marxist approach seems to be reactionary. We're reacting to stuff. And it doesn't matter if you're reacting to something that's way too far to the left or way too far to the right. Whenever you are purely reacting, you are always going to go wrong.
Yes. You're gonna go excessively in the other direction, and you're gonna create another excessive reaction among your opponents, and then it just ratchets up and up, and pretty soon you're the Jaredites who are sleeping on their swords, right? So I just read I'm in the Book of Ether in the Book of Mormon in my personal reading right now. So that's why I bring
Hmm.
that up. But the
And
Book of Mormon describes this dynamic perfectly. It really does.
yeah. And like identifying an enemy doesn't, it's good, but it doesn't matter ultimately.
Right,
Like
right.
you can have 100% valid critiques of something. That doesn't mean that your opposition to that or your solution to that is going to be correct just because you've pointed out 20 correct things that are wrong with something.
Right. Now, in the woke worldview, though, it doesn't matter. What
Exactly.
matters is
Yeah.
power. And so, whatever you have to say or do to defeat these people who oppose you and gain more power for yourself, that's what you have to do. Okay. So, okay, let's move on. And here's a meme that I really like, and it says complaints about capitalism. And this is Scooby Doo. Some of you are too young to understand what's going on here, but
I
at
think
the
the
end of
meme
these,
has made it extend past its natural life though.
yeah, yeah. So at the end of these episodes of this cartoon, Scooby Doo, that some of us watched when we were kids, they would unmask the villain. And it wasn't who you thought it was going to be. Okay. So complaints about capitalism. No, he takes off the mask, and they're just complaints about the human condition. So that is so much of this is people just wishing that the world were not so turbulent and confusing and frustrating, right? And so but it is, and so you crave it to be something different, and if you're not grounded in reality, then people sell you on a utopian fantasy. Say, yeah, the world is awful in all these ways, but it doesn't have to be, right? We can flip a switch and make it something other than what it is, right? So complaints about the human condition are at the heart of, I would say, most of the woke worldview. Okay. And finally, number 6, projection is when you say things about the other people that are true of you. Okay.
Hmm. Uh-huh.
So the other team, look at those right-wing authoritarians, and that is spoken by left-wing authoritarian people who have a very authoritarian Marxist worldview that's all about power, right? Um, the other team is uninterested in the truth. The other team is hateful. The other team is an echo chamber, right? A lot of times when you hear these things from the woke left and the woke right, they're telling on themselves is what's happening.
Hmm.
So be careful when you
I
hear those
was
things.
I have to do research of like clips of things that people say for my day job. And just today, a couple hours ago, I saw a guy make a video of how this interview that Trump just did shows his mental decline and the media's not covering it. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is the same exact thing that the right was doing 8 months ago. And
Yeah,
it's like the same exact talking points, everything, but just switching the
yeah.
person. And now that Biden, I think, actually was doing the
Yes,
mental
he
decline.
was.
But
Let's be
just like,
clear.
yeah, he definitely was. But just
Right.
like I was so surprised by this guy's ability to just there's a meme of this too where you take out the disc of last
Yes.
week's outrage and then you hook in the new thing that's completely contrary to what you were
Yes.
saying a couple months ago, and then you just start shooting that on, and the comments are all, yeah,
Right.
Trump's an idiot, he's losing it, the country's going down. You look at the polls, you look at the stock market, like that's not actually happening in
Nope.
reality. Maybe it will in the future, maybe they're on to something that hasn't shown up in
Yeah.
the polls or the economy yet, but like, yeah, the echo chamber is
Yeah.
extreme, and the projection is very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. You can see this all the time. When people are on the woke left or the woke right, they will formulate accusations against their opponents that are true of themselves. And so like James Lindsay calls it the iron law of woke projection. I love that phrase. It applies on both the left and the right. So Um, now, wokeness supersedes Christianity. And I bring this up because when you have a friend or loved one who goes woke, you're going to notice something really, really profound happen in them. And it's going to happen with their relationship to their faith. If they're a Latter-day Saint, all of a sudden it's going to be like, whoa, you have a whole different religion now that puts you in conflict with the prophets. You're going to be accusing President Nelson of not being either, woke enough on the left or not based enough on the right, right? They're not enough. They're not extreme enough, right? And then there's the normies. Everybody else are normies. They're not awakened to this critical consciousness that I have, right?
Hmm.
Um, so here's this quote: conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. Okay. So I'm that's all of this quote that I'm going to read, but the person who said it was Paulo Freire. He was a Marxist educator, right? So conversion to the people. There's that biblical language of conversion, right? And it feels like a conversion for people when they go woke. They have new prophets like Paulo Freire. He's one of them. These revered figures, new sacred texts, new rituals, new sacraments, new theology, and new notions of sin and redemption. Wokeness provides people with all of these new things. It's a new religious framework. So that is why you'll notice that when people transition to this kind of worldview, it's pretty intense. It really is like a religion. Okay, and recommended reading. So the reason I have been thinking about this for many years now is because of two books that I read. I read one when I was at BYU called Wild Swans, and that is a story of three generations of Chinese women during the time of Mao Zedong. And there's another one written by James Buchan, and it's called Days of God, The Revolution in Iran and Its Consequences. So one of these is a story of a left-wing revolution, a Marxist left-wing revolution, and the other one is a story of a right-wing revolution under the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran. Read both of these books. And I think you will see what I saw reading both of these books. You are reading the same story. The way that these people think, destroying their societies and imposing like this new kind of worldview and these new like terrible things that they do. It is the same story on the left and the right. If you don't believe me, read these two books one after the other, and I think you'll be convinced. And then finally, there's also my book. If you want to just understand kind of a believing and sustaining Latter-day Saint perspective on Marxism, that's why I wrote that book. So anyway, Luke, any questions?
My question would be, how susceptible do you think Latter-day Saints are to both of them?
Wow.
What level of concern do you have?
I do have some concern, and part of this is in my book, I tried to talk about some examples of where scripture is misused in the service of Marxism, like this idea of a society where people have things in common and the United Order. You'll have a lot of people on the left who say, "Oh, Joseph Smith was teaching Marxism. Joseph Smith was teaching communism. The early Christian community was communist, and stuff like that." And then you might have passages like in the Book of Ether, for example, where we're told that this nation must serve the Lord. It absolutely must. That is, the promise. There are promises to this nation as long as we are serving the Lord, and those promises are withdrawn when we stop serving the Lord. So my fear on the right is that Latter-day Saints might look at things like that and say, "Oh, we need Christian nationalism." So I'm going to promote these crackpot figures on the political right because the scriptures tell me to do it. No, they don't. No, they don't.
Hmm.
These people are not serving the Lord when they fantasize about a barren Trump king imposing the Baptist religion on America. They're not
Yeah.
serving the Lord when they do that. They're
Yeah.
not fulfilling what the Book of Ether is telling us. So,
Yeah, I think the left side, fighting patriarchy, fighting racism, all that kind of stuff is more prevalent and it has a lot more pull because for like the right wing thing again, Mormons are not included in the Christian nationalism state. Like we don't get a
right,
seat at that table, and so
right.
there's not as much of a draw for members to go in that direction. I think there is some problem there. The vax made some problems, but I
Yeah,
think the kind of the more right-leaning members problem is if they become purely reactionary to the left.
yeah,
If it's always if the gospel becomes more about trying to own the Salt Lake Tribune or Julie Hanks or John DeLynn or any of these people instead of sticking with that foundation and opposing things in service of sticking to that foundation rather than just opposing them for the sake of opposing them as the bad guys.
yeah,
That's kind of my read on it, at least right now. But I definitely have some concerns about how far the anti-Semitism might start going into the membership.
yes,
Uh, oh, and the marriage thing, like the this kind of male female men and women battle of the sexes, especially within marriage, how much
yes.
that might be a future problem for more of the right leaning members of the church.
Yeah. So woke left appeals to empathy.
Hmm.
And then it perverts it and twists it and makes it into this horrible oppressive system, right? And the gospel actually teaches us to empathize in healthy ways, right? That if your empathy is grounded in the gospel, you're going to have empathy and kindness and these things and a concern for the marginalized and you know uh so the woke left will take those things that you have cultivated in your faith and will twist them into something and say, okay, we can flip this switch. And these things that you learned in your faith, you bring those to your Marxism, and here you'll become this revolutionary, right? This activist. The woke right appeals to things that we learn about the value of order. Okay. It's, I wish Latter-day Saints understood how valuable it is what we learn about order in our faith. Just having a system where the rules and guidelines and everybody comes together and we participate in an order. It's incredibly valuable to
Hmm.
have that to actually internalize the value of order. Christian nationalism promises order in a really extreme, crazy way, right? The woke right is going, they're going to appeal to your love of order and want to make you into an activist that, you know, that brings forward an oppressive king, you know. So yeah, we are vulnerable to having good elements of our faith warped and twisted in the service of authoritarianism. And that's what woke left and woke right are trying to do.
Agreed. And one more question. What's the danger of people using this discussion about wokeness just as a weapon to attack the other side rather than to have some introspection, or at least maybe to realize that not w- understanding wokeness is kind of like a hammer. It doesn't mean that
Yeah.
everything's a nail, right?
Yes. Right. So not everything. So, and that's why, I outlined 6 things that I think are common elements of wokeness that, most people, when they talk about wokeness, they're talking about some combination of those things. But not everything that I dislike should be called wokeness. Not every utopian vision is a woke utopian vision. Not every, look for where these things come together and are influenced by Marxist theory and those kinds of things. And let's try to be rigorous instead of calling everything woke. Um, some people call Donald Trump a fascist, for example, which is a way of saying he's woke right. I don't believe that. And I didn't believe that Kamala Harris, for example, I don't believe that she's a Marxist. I think she just kind of follows whatever donors tell her to do. I don't
Yeah,
believe
I could see that.
I think she has some pieces of her worldview that are kind of Marxist. I think she has some of those influences, but I don't see somebody who has jumped into the left-hand path, right? And is now like the whole world needs to burn unless we can make it right. I don't see that in Kamala Harris. I see somebody who does what donors tell her to do. And Donald Trump, yeah, he does have some tendencies that are kind of nationalistic, kind of authoritarian, but he also has these situations where he'll say like, "Hey, Democrats, come sit down with me. Let's talk. Let's make a deal. Let's work together." Those kinds of things. That is not fascism. Like he has this side to him that is very collaborative, very open to other points of view. So that's why, you know, again, if you're but these labels can sometimes be that thing, that hammer, and everything looks like a nail, right? So
Yep.
be careful, be disciplined in how you use these labels.
Well, I appreciate it, Dan. I think, and I want to continue this kind of conversation going forward on the channel. So I'm glad that we have this at the beginning.
Very good.
And thank you to the audience. Obviously, very new channel. Liking, subscribing, sharing it with people you think would like it is important and appreciated. And of course, if you have any recommendations or thoughts, or you just want to yell at me, I will read the comments and try and pull out information that will let me give as much value to you, the viewer, as possible. But until next time, thank you, Dan, and thank you, all of you. I'm Luke Hansen, and this is Doctrine and Governance.